I'm Shannon McMenamin, host of the Red Shed Tapes and part of the leadership team running our family-owned company. Growing up, my dad always drove a van. My brothers and I spent a lot of time rolling around in the back of those vans. In the center between the bucket seats, my dad always had a cassette holder full of bootlegs of Grateful Dead shows. They were the soundtrack to our early lives. I've long been intrigued by these tapes in the spirit of that bootleg music and how it kind of travels from person to person. This interconnectedness and retelling of stories through music and passing it on by word of mouth. The handing off of a cassette tape is a time-honored tradition, and it seems that now this tradition is kind of morphed into something else entirely through playlists, blogs, podcasts. This podcast, The Red Shed Tapes, is keeping that tradition alive. It's just like our first small bar, The Red Shed. A place to swap stories, build community, share our love of beer, art, and music, just like passing along a bootleg tape. When you spend 40 years building bars and restaurants and places for people to stay, you make a lot of friends, a lot of history, and a lot of stories. There's my dad, my uncle, my brothers, cousins, and a whole host of people that make McMenamins what it is. That includes our guests. They're part of our family too. This podcast is for them, the communities where we operate, and all the people who have worked with us over 4 decades to build something special. When people listen to the Red Shed Tapes, I want them to consider it their window into the world of McMenamins. All the challenges and all the fun. In each episode, we'll share our history, the incredible stories that have shaped our company, and hear from the people who helped us along the way. This podcast is a reflection on how our company continues to take shape, not just where we've been, but where we're going. In this first episode of the Red Shed Tapes, you'll get to meet my dad and Uncle Brian and learn more about how they started McMenamins. And I'll introduce you to a McMenamins institution, Thursday Jane. Then we'll take a trip to our first small bar and podcast namesake, The Red Shed. Grab a pint and settle in. The story of McMenamins as we know it today starts in the 1980s. With my dad, Mike, and my Uncle Brian. These two shy away from attention and resist taking credit. They prefer the one-on-one conversation and bristle at being interviewed.
I feel like I'm chained to this chair now.
Mike and Brian are known to most people as the McMenamin brothers. My Uncle Brian is 6 years younger than my dad.
I was the one that was trying to follow the rules, and he was the one that was breaking every single one of them, which was fun.
It's a balance.
Yeah.
He'd sneak downstairs to get some sodas out of the fridge, which we weren't supposed to have, and then we'd stay up all night and watch science fiction movies. And
We both had some common interests.
yes, we did.
Today, my dad is distinguishable by his long white beard. You usually find him at our pubs inspecting the light fixtures and light bulbs. My Uncle Brian, he's more of a mustache kind of guy, and he's fond of sampling the new ales on tap. Over 40 years, they've created the most visually recognizable group of brew pubs, restaurants, and hotels in the Pacific Northwest. My dad says their start was anything but illustrious. It came after a decade of trial and error in opening bars, delis, wine shops, and a particularly troublesome distribution business.
I was looking for something to do after a total failure at distributing, although I learned so much about what we're doing now at that time that really got us into brewing and winemaking. So after the distributorship closed, I had to figure out something to do. I knew I had to get back into a pub of some sort of service thing, because that was fun. And the pub allows you a lot of freedom.
My dad found freedom and fun when he opened the Barley Mill Pub in what was once a corner tavern at Southeast 17th and Hawthorne Boulevard in Portland, Oregon.
The Fat Little Rooster, that was the previous name of the Barley Mill. They had live music, and it was a dive bar, and they didn't have a lot of rules. And so it was exciting to go there. And so it closed down because it was too exciting for the neighborhood.
That was in 1983. The neighborhood at the time was in dire straits. Hawthorne Boulevard was dubbed Heroin Boulevard. And the bars with their dark windows and loud crowds were fun to hang out in, but not to live nearby.
They were shut down by the neighborhood and city council. And so had to go through that neighborhood association and the city council to get back open, so that was it's an eye-opener.
When you applied for a license, they'd send out letters to the neighborhood, and especially schools that are close by or churches or whatever. And so we had to go to a lot of those meetings, which could be very contentious. There's people, why are you putting a tavern next to our church or our school? Because that was evil. And we would explain we're trying to be a community gathering spot like a school or a church or whatever. And, a lot of people weren't buying into that. It took a while.
You want the neighborhood to come in. You don't want to keep them out, so you have to work with them. You have to provide something that they need and respected. The Barley Mill has a vast history going back to the 30s. The Scuttlebutt Tavern, where all the sailors used to hang out, and then a Fat Little Rooster, where all the ingrates used to hang out, like us.
I mean, don't you think people looking at it now have no idea kind of what it was like back then here?
Probably not. You should have seen the regulars when they came into Barley Mill after we took the Mylar off the windows and opened it up. They're covering their eyes going, what's changed? What's changed in this place?
The same thing at Tavern and Pool, all those places. Yeah, all the early ones.
So some of those people didn't last, but a lot of them did and really enjoyed it. It was a learning process for us too, about how to operate a place and how to operate a place successfully.
At this point in the story, I should step back a minute because you're probably asking yourself, how do two self-proclaimed ingrates decide they want to run family-friendly pubs? I'll let Uncle Brian explain.
Mike and I both traveled over Europe at different times and really saw what it was like. The whole family sitting around a table having a beer, dogs under the table, kids running around, and it was everyday life. And you go, God, that's just the way it should be.
Something you go to every day. That was always attractive, I think, to us, to have your sandwich or to have your glass of beer after work or whatever, or meet your friends.
Meet your friends or meet your neighbors or whoever, yeah.
Meeting over a glass of beer was also a tradition with our extended family. As a little kid in Portland, I remember huge parties and family celebrations. So Grandpa Bob, he was a beer drinker. What do you think about what you guys were up to? Do you remember anything that he would say about it? Or, you kind of mentioned that he'd just kind of, this is nice.
Actually, he loved it.
He was supportive. Man.
He was supportive?
Very supportive, yeah, right from the beginning, which was great.
But we kind of learned the whole thing from Dad. I mean, there was nothing better than sitting around the table chewing the fat and having beers. There's just nothing better than that, That's basically what we're doing still.
Some of those parties took place in my Grandpa Charlie's basement bar, a spot that inspired the amber lighting, whiskey, and knotty pine that decorate our bars and restaurants.
It had the black and red tiles, and it just had a classic sort of feel and a smell. You did all kinds of carpentry and whatnot, so it was always had a wood smell and a basement smell and a
cigar smell.
And, when you're a kid, that's just like, wow. We've tried to get to that level ever since, I think.
Yeah.
As great a bar as he had in his basement.
The attraction to actually brewing beer came from a different place. Friend and brewmaster Charles, or Chuck Curry, of Oregon's first craft brewery, Cartwright Brewing Company. Can you tell me a little bit more about him and what he inspired in you?
He was really a smart guy. He was one of the first winery people in Oregon. He was the first brewery person in Oregon. He just had this thing that never completely fully realized maybe, but the high adventure and the romanticism and the explosiveness. But it was exciting because he was a little older and he was electric. He really got me pumped up to do stuff.
For all you beer nerds out there, a little trivia. The mill in the Barley Mill Pub was inspired by Cartwright Brewing. You can find the original mill from Cartwright in the pub today. It's not completely retired. We fire it up once a year for a special anniversary brew. More on that in another episode. Shortly after opening the Barley Mill and 2 other pubs, my dad and Uncle Brian were ready to start brewing their own beer. But there was a problem. In the mid-'80s in Oregon, it wasn't legal to serve beer where it was made. Wineries faced a similar issue a few years earlier. They were able to get a law passed that allowed tasting rooms on site. So my dad and uncle, and a now famous group of Oregon's early beer and wine scene, tried to do something similar.
We were the restaurant trying to brew beer, and those guys are all breweries that wanted to have a restaurant.
My uncle and dad worked with Kurt and Rob Widmer, Dick and Nancy Ponzi, Art Lawrence, and Fred Bowman to convince legislators to change the law.
Dick Ponzi was a central figure in that because he was part of the whole winery scene and involved in getting that legislation passed. And so he was involved with us and the guy and Whitmer's.
That was a big help.
So there's already a path, and Dick already knew some people down there. We all did our due diligence and discussed matters in depth.
Well, what did that look like, going and getting it done?
Running around the hallways looking for people.
You mean down
tracking them down in Salem?
Not looking because they don't want to be caught.
Trying to avoid you.
There's lobbyists and there's everybody trailing everyone that comes out of their office.
How long did it take?
I think we got it through right at the end of the session.
We had our lobbyists talk to their lobbyists.
Oh, there we go. The 1985 brewpub law changed Oregon dining and beer culture forever. It's hard to imagine a time in Oregon when you couldn't order a pint when you went to see a movie, or bring your kids along to eat dinner together at a brewpub. That's all thanks to the brewpub law. Right after the law passed, we were the first to take advantage of it, brewing and serving beer at the Hillsdale Brewery and Public House in Southwest Portland. The way my dad and Brian tell it, brewing was not an immediate success.
We were really good at making really bad beer.
We were bumbling idiots,
but we got better.
We got better.
We hired someone that
we
knew what they were doing.
We brought other people in.
You did a lot of experimenting in the early days, and really, we still do as a company. But what stands out to you from the beginning?
I remember picking, blackberries off the bushes out back at Hillsdale.
Yeah.
And throwing those in the beer, fruit beer. Yeah, go figure.
But even after they hired brewers, and really they were home brewers back in those days, they still had to convince customers to drink our beers.
I always remember the first time we put beer out at Hillsdale on the bar, and the guys regulars are all lined up there to try it, and they go, nobody's gonna drink this stuff, you can't even see through it, because they're used to drinking, Budweiser or whatever. And yeah, you look at it now and you take it for granted that, of course, you're not going to be able to see through all the beers because you got all these different types. It wasn't even thought of then.
After opening their 3rd neighborhood pub, my dad and Brian started experimenting beyond beer. They opened up the business to include artists, musicians, gardeners, and historians. The goal was to create artwork that told the story of each pub location and the people who designed it.
Well, we were lucky enough to have a couple of pubs that were reasonably successful, so then you can have time to work with an artist or a neighbor or whatever that I could see might be able to offer something in our general thought of what we'd like to do that could really make it happen. Then you start adding those elements where it's artwork, it's a little bit of history, or it's music, or some of those things that started entering the company at that point to have some variety and give it some more gravitas.
It's not just the art and the music and the history. It's also all of the people who are in the places, or who have helped us to get to where we are now.
That's a part that really hasn't been talked about, is all the people that we've all worked with all these years, and they're still here. People get into this business thinking, I'll just do it until I figure out what I'm going to do. And then, poof, 40 years later, there you are.
We have 3rd generation people working. Luckily, in our business, those types of creative people seem to gravitate toward this business. You're full of screenwriters and authors and painters and poets and all kinds of fabulous folks. So then you just have to be able to have the time to connect with them and have some sort of avenue or venue for them to do it. You can do all the fun things and still make it work somehow. That still baffles us, I think, because it's not like you're working. It's like you're delving into all the things that you love the most, and it can actually be a business. But it's not a business. It's a love affair with people, more or less. That's kind of what it is.
If somebody would have told me with real certainty that in 40 years I would still be around, of course, not knowing that there would be so many other things besides just working, at a pub, I don't think I would have been able to even understand it.
I don't remember the first time I met Thursday Jane. She's just always been there. I had the chance to sit down with Thursday out at Edgefield, our first large hotel property in Troutdale, Oregon. I wanted to know about when she met my dad and my Uncle Brian, and about her 40 years at McMenamins. Everything about Thursday is special, including how she got hired.
My friend Michelle said, you should come put an application into this new bar. And she said, it's where the Fat Little Rooster used to be. And I said, well, I've gone there a lot. I know right where that is. That had been a pretty happening nightclub. The Paul DeLay band played there, and Robert Cray, and, all the people that were popular then. But yeah, I walked in, and of course it was so completely different because it had been this dank, smoky nightclub for so long. And it was just this beautiful place, and there were just what seemed like hundreds of plants everywhere.
That place was and is the Barley Mill, where we still serve beer and food in Southeast Portland. In the neighborhood today, you'll see local stores, restaurants, apartments, and the occasional hippie.
And your dad happened to be there while I was filling out my application. And I didn't know who he was. He didn't introduce himself as the owner of the place.
Did you just think he was like a regular at the bar who was just hanging out?
Yeah, he came in and he ordered a Budweiser, and he said, who's got that great VW bus out front? And I said, that's me. And then we sat there and talked about old buses and the Grateful Dead.
I have to stop here for a second, because like I told you at the beginning of the podcast, the Grateful Dead is very important to our story. My dad's probably seen more than 100 Grateful Dead shows. There's Dead references all through our properties, including product names, a bar dedicated to Jerry Garcia, and even Grateful Dead song notes hidden in plain sight as part of stained glass windows. Okay, back to Thursday.
And I told him about all the shows I went to in San Francisco. And he said, well, how do you even know about those shows? And I said, well, do you have something to write with? I can give you the phone number. And it was this hotline that you called in San Francisco that would tell you all the upcoming shows.
So it was kind of an instant connection.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, I had no idea who he was. Clearly, he was smart and he was funny and he just seemed like this really kind, nice man. But once I realized that he was the owner, I thought, okay, this is probably going to work out. It had a family feeling to it. I felt like I was part of something that was going to be so cool and so incredible.
After her time tending bar at the Barley Mill, Thursday went on to work at our first brew pub. Actually, the first brew pub in Oregon, the Hillsdale Pub and Brewery. She was there before and after the brew pub law passed, and helped introduce people to McMenamins microbrews, some of which are still just as popular today.
Brew pubs were so new, and making your own beer was so new. I felt like I was this ambassador. I was like, okay, you guys all know about this beer from Europe that we've had on tap, but now there's this beer that we're making. This beer is fresh. It's made right back here.
Hammerhead, Ruby, Terminator. We still have all of those on tap today.
Oh, the Ruby, when that was on tap, suddenly people who had never had anything more than a Budweiser were drinking Ruby. Ruby was really a lighter beer But because it was a brew pub beer, there was just a little more heft to it. And this just beautiful, very light fruit flavor running through it.
Few people know Thursday Jane has been more than an ambassador when it comes to Ruby Ale. She's also been a muse. McMenamin's most prominent artist, Lyle Hain, immortalized Thursday in several paintings at our pubs. Her face brightens the ruby on the wall at our Tavern and Pool pub in Northwest Portland.
Before Lyle painted it, he said, I'm doing a big painting for Tavern and Pool, and Ruby's going to be in the painting. And if you look at the rubies through the year, they're all a little bit different. He said, I'd really like to base this one just a little bit on you. Is that okay? It's like, okay. Oh, I might have to sit down here for a minute. I was so flattered. I was so excited.
Some of those rubies are definitely you. I see you. I'm like, that's a Thursday ruby. I don't have enough fingers to count all the different jobs and locations where Thursday has worked. She started at the Barley Mill, was at Hillsdale, the Greenway Pub. These days, you can find Thursday giving history and art tours at Edgefield.
So when you're walking through the hallways here, you're seeing real stories being told. There's real people in the artwork. My favorite person is in this painting.
Feels like having you in that position where you're able to be this like really welcoming presence that you've always been in our company.
I think Edgefield just really embodies all the amazing art and the music and, all the different interesting things that are always happening. People who come out here, I think when they leave, they have such a fuller understanding of what this company is about. You start realizing what it is that these two brothers stand for, what's important to them. Even though this, to me, is just one big giant pub.
As I think about it, it makes sense that Thursday is out here leading tours. She's a tour guide of our history because she lived it. And she's special to me because in the early days of McMenamins, I was either too young, or I'll be honest, too into my friends to take it all in.
I don't know how old you were when they bought this, but it was so horrible.
I mean, I remember walking through the property when it was vacant and there was nothing going on, and my mom wanting to keep us kids really close to her because she was afraid of boards breaking or, what we could possibly hurt ourselves on in this dark abandoned building. And I was absolutely fascinated by it. Oh. Absolutely fascinated.
Yeah. Boy, I was one of the early doubters, Shannon. I thought, oh my God, what have these guys done?
I don't think you were alone.
Not only did Mike and Brian have this incredible vision for what this property could be, there's not a single thing out here right now, not one that they weren't talking about in 1990. Ideas for what this place could look like, what it would be for people who came out here, and to have watched it all happen, it's just been the most satisfying thing.
Why do you keep sticking around? Why? That sounds bad.
Are you ever going to retire?
We're not trying to get rid of you, Thursday. We love you. What speaks to you about McMenamins, about this company and this life that you've been living with us?
I honestly think that Mike and Brian, their appreciation for the people who work for them, and my gosh, at this point, not everybody gets to know those two like I did. But that feeling that was there in the beginning is still rippling through the company. Prior to working for McMenamins, I'd always waited tables, but I was just somebody who was on the schedule. I didn't feel like I was doing anything that extraordinary. And Your dad and your uncle always made me feel, whatever job I had in the company, they made me feel like I was doing really important work. Having all these different locations and being successful at what they set out to do, I never once have thought, well, they're still nice guys, but it's not like it was in the beginning. Not ever. And I've been there from the beginning, and it's always been the same. It's just a couple guys.
You can still find Thursday out at Edgefield giving tours. She told me she plans to be with us a long time.
I often joke about giving my tours while I'm driving around one of those little rascals.
Oh, I love it. Tour guide to the end.
Yes, exactly.
If you take our company and all the things that it is, all the things that it could be, and you distill it down to its very essence, you'll have the Red Shed. The Red Shed is a small bar of ours. It lives out at our Edgefield property out in Troutdale, Oregon, and it's right along the Columbia River Gorge. Edgefield used to be the old Multnomah County Poor Farm, but sat vacant for many years and was destined for demolition before we got our hands on it. Patrick McNerney, who was the head gardener out at Edgefield when we started doing that project in the 90s, I believe he was probably one of the ones who originally found that shed, too. And he still works for McMenamins today.
It was 3/4 covered in blackberries. The walls in the front were stucco and painted red, and the back of the building was wood with a large brick chimney. I do remember walking around with Mike. We were both interested in what that little thing was for. It was the incinerator for the property. That's what I was told. We talked about what are we going to do with these little small spaces, and he was very excited about the idea of having a small bar where just a few people could gather, and it would be charming and completely different.
Do you remember naming the Red Shed?
I started calling it the Little Red Shed, kind of right off the bat. Just the Little Red Shed.
And it's stuck.
Yeah. There's room for a small bar, 3 or 4 tables, little tables in the front, and a bench in the back room.
At McMenamins, we love preserving old buildings. Churches, schools, and funeral homes, you name it. We turn them into brew pubs and bars. And small spaces, such as broom closets, principals' offices, and farm sheds, we turn those into bars too. I'm sure that somebody was really excited about that storage. It's like, that's a perfect place to keep your buckets. And it's like, no. We're going to put customers in there, and we're going to have drinks in there, and we're going to have to find somewhere else to put the buckets and the mops and the shovels. So, yeah, typically we're short on storage and heavy on bars. I had no idea why my dad and uncle thought this little shed would be a great bar, but they couldn't pass it up. It's probably their fascination with small spaces as places to connect with people. There's no way to not meet your neighbors when you're in the places like the Red Shed. It's too small. You're going to be bumping into them anyway. You got to get to know people. And I think that that's also kind of the special quality of those places and those spaces, is that you get that. And you never know what somebody's story is. And you're going to probably hear it whether you want to or not because of the proximity. You know, it's just a tiny space. And it's a casual thing, like super family friendly. You're just under the trees and you get that, you know, you're on the gorge. So you get the wind blowing, and it's just really relaxing. It's an opportunity, you know, like all these little things that present themselves, especially on a property like Edgefield where it's buried over time by blackberries and neglect. You find stuff that people have left behind or built over time, and it's good. Edgefield is a big property, 84 acres. You know, when you get a chance to kind of sit out there, and it feels so away from everything else. So it's kind of a break from reality in a lot of ways. And there's this tiny little hidden spot in the middle of a lawn area with trees and a pond. And I mean, you could walk right by it and not even notice, but once you find it, you're in. Every memory I have in the Red Shed is a great memory. I'm Shannon McMenamin. Thanks for joining me for the Red Shed Tapes. I'll leave you today with this line from the artist Joe Cotter and friends. Here's to it, and here's from it, and here's to it again. If you ever get to it and don't do it, you may never get to it to do it again. Cheers. We'll see you at the pub.
The Red Shed Tapes podcast is lovingly produced by McMenamins and their production partner Maxwell, an independent creative agency. This episode was expertly recorded and edited by Gretchen Kilby. Special thanks to the production team at Maxwell, particularly guest wrangler and storyteller Jess Linus. A shout out to McMenamins' Renee Rank Ignacio for having the dream and maintaining the flame, Shannon McMenamin for hosting, and McMenamins' longtime storyteller and videographer extraordinaire, Kat Nyberg, for years of chronicling our people, places, and happenings, setting the standard for authenticity and charting the course for what this podcast could be. The podcast theme music was written by our friends at Wonderly. Thanks also to all of our listeners and supporters. This episode of the Red Shed Tapes is dedicated to Lyle Hain, a longtime McMenamins artist and visionary who left us too soon.